Hello, I'm Kathy from Pearson. Welcome to today's webinar on the new basics, integrating the transferable life skills of enterprising behaviours and capabilities. Today I have the great pleasure of introducing Glenn Fishman, who was co-author of the Pearson Humanities Victoria series on the teacher support materials. Glenn's been a teacher of business, economics, accounting and civics for over 13 years. Previously, he was head of business at Frankston High School. Glenn's also a familiar face for many of you as a regular presenter at the VCTA annual conference. Most recently, Glenn was involved in BCAR's Civics Curriculum Development Project, which has reinforced his love for teaching of civics and introduced him to a new love, developmental rubrics. Without further ado, over to you, Glenn.
So today I'll be speaking about 5 key areas. So the first one is transferable life skills and enterprising behaviours, and then developing skill progressions within students across a curriculum, task design, which feeds on from that, how to make real-world links between the classroom and the real world, obviously, and lessons from a real-life student entrepreneurship subject, which focused on the $20 boss. So at Frankston High School, I was involved in developing 3 subjects. One of them was a subject called innovation, which was focused on teaching students entrepreneurship. The second was wealth and work, which was focused on personal finance and career development. And the third was politics and power, which was looking at tracking issues and developing awareness of politics and issues within society. So within wealth and work, I made a key decision in the last few years to evolve the subject away from looking at specific topics and more towards transferable skills. And one of the key skills that I identified along with my faculty was that we needed to teach kids to be able to make informed decisions. And we had a few discussions about how to approach that and decided that criteria and the development and weighting and ranking of criteria was critical in terms of leading students to make informed decisions. And we thought if we could teach students that process, it didn't matter what we applied it to. And the consequence of that was the development of a car purchase assignment, which you'll see aspects of in this presentation. Part of the link for that was the Pearson textbook. It gave me some ideas that informed that assignment, and certainly the idea of cost-benefit analysis is one of the key aspects of that assignment, which you'll see shortly. So the assignment works off students having choice. So this is an example which flows through the entire assignment. So there's a case study, and then the whole assignment has a worked example showing how students should approach the task, but then they had their own choices. So each of the case studies had a budget, a certain amount of savings, a gender, and a case study that set out their particular interests or requirements in purchasing a car. In order to assess this task, we developed a developmental rubric, and we were looking for key aspects of that process of making an informed decision that we thought were the most important things for students to demonstrate. And what we really wanted was for students to make criteria, but also to employ them effectively, and also to review that process at the end and decide whether they thought that the criteria actually worked to help them make a decision at the end of it. So this is one aspect of the task. So the students, after reading the case study, needed to decide what the most important criteria were for that particular person. So in this case, this is the exemplar. I decided that for this particular person that they had 5 main areas that they thought were important, which was purchase price, reliability, safety, running costs, and insurance costs. So what I asked the students to do is link the case study back to the particular criteria that they've chosen, and then also explain why they thought that particular criteria was important. So they might have had 10 options and they've chosen 5 of them. And then I asked them to rank them in order of importance, because I believe in order to create weighted criteria, you need to be able to tell you which are the most important and which are the least important. The next step in this task was then to weight each of the criteria. So once you've actually weighted them and given them a numerical value, then the students could justify the particular weighting, linking it back to the case study, and then work out how they're actually going to assess that particular criteria. So you can see purchase price is a pretty straightforward one, but things like safety are far more complex decisions. Do you just rely on safety ratings, or do you look at a list of features? Do you look at videos of crash tests and go into the NCAP ratings? It depends what the student decides to do in terms of assessing it. So there's lots of range for students to make decisions within this task. Once they've created those criteria, they then need to identify different cars. So again, I'm only showing one part of the task, but the students needed to pick 3 cars. In this case, they're looking at a Toyota Yaris. So they then have looked at the overall score available for each of the criteria, and then they judge it. So if the reliability of a Yaris is considered to be really high, they've given it 20 out of a possible 20 marks. Whereas safety, the total marks available was 10. They've decided a 4-star rating in this day and age is not particularly fantastic, so they've only given it 5 out of 10. So once they've got a score for each of the different vehicles, then the best car is obvious, because the car with the highest score should be the one that the person should select. So in terms of assessing this, we've used a developmental rubric again, and there are 2 aspects of it. The first was forming the judgment and looking at how they've actually gone about making the decision and whether they've justified it logically and so forth. And the other aspect was actually evaluating the information. So whether they've used more than one source, whether they've thought about the accuracy of the information, whether it's relevant to Australia or not, whether it's a foreign website and whether that is applicable to Australia, and then also cross-checking the resources that they've looked at for accuracy, so to make sure that the actual information they've relied upon is truthful. So these criteria I would use not just for this task, but for any task that was looking at making informed decisions. The last part of the task, they had to recommend the car, how much they thought they should pay for it based on their research, evaluate and discuss whether their criteria were effective, explain how they would change the criteria if they were to do it again, and then finally to discuss whether the car that was chosen by that process was actually the best option for the person, or whether they feel the criteria actually led them to the wrong decision. So this, I'm obviously not going to read the whole thing out. This is an example of how I would want students to express their answer. So it goes through all of those questions that were just talked about, but it's obviously an extended kind of response. In the innovation subject, which is focused on entrepreneurship and developing a business, we're looking at what the key behaviours around innovation actually are, and identified the fact that taking risks and accepting failure, or the potential for failure, was really, really important for students. And many of them didn't like this, because across their whole life, they've always been focused on succeeding, and failure is often something that they don't want to contemplate. And therefore, when they found that their businesses were actually not functioning as well as they wanted them to, they found it very difficult to accept that possibly their business wasn't going to be successful. So the $20 Boss project, which is from the Foundation for Young Australians, allows students to take this opportunity to experience taking a risk with someone else's money and no consequences, and then to experience whether they're going to achieve success or failure and how they'll deal with that. So it's worth having a look at the FYA website to get a bit more information about that program. Another aspect that we consider to be really important for developing enterprising behaviours was speaking in public. So within this task, or within this subject, we had 2 tasks. The first was just to run a food-based business within the school, and the second was the actual $20 Boss, where they had far more scope to create businesses of far different natures. Within both of them, I built in many opportunities for students to present to their peers, but also to other staff members. And I think ideally I would want them to present their concepts to a panel of experts from the community. And what I found across all the groups was there would be 1 or 2 students who could present, and the rest who would try and rely on notes or PowerPoints or other forms of scaffolding, and they really struggled to move away from that model of presentation. And some of the students improved dramatically across the semester, and others just would refuse to move away from those supports, and consequently their speaking in public didn't change. But the other aspect of this task that was great in this area was in running businesses that were outside of the school lots of the students had to speak to people in the community, whether it was approaching vet practices to try and sell their, one business developed a reusable and recyclable dog poo bag. They needed to approach businesses in order to sell them, and calling up those businesses and being rejected and speaking to people in person and being rejected again, and then trying again and going to a dog obedience school and being rejected again. It taught those students a lot of skills in terms of getting better at phrasing their proposals, but also accepting that not everyone is going to be interested in your ideas. So regardless of the fact that business didn't work out as well as the students had hoped, I feel they learnt an awful lot about communication from it. Another aspect that we found was really critical for students to run their businesses effectively was organisation. So communicating within groups and communicating outside of their groups with other people was quite a challenge for a lot of these students. For instance, some of the businesses required them to work with businesses overseas in order to supply components, and some students would allocate roles to each other and people wouldn't follow through or wouldn't commit to what they'd promised, and other students would end up taking over everything and not allowing other students to participate to their full extent, and other students would avoid completely responsibility. So the groups got better at improving their organisation, but in many of the groups, unless there was a strong leader who organised the other students, quite often the businesses failed not because they had a bad idea, they failed because their organisation wasn't up to scratch or people didn't follow through on what they'd promised. So I think not only from an organisational perspective was this useful, it also taught them about human nature and working with other people. So again, it was a fantastic opportunity, although some of the students didn't see it that way. So as part of the VCAR professional development that I was involved in over the last year, we're looking at developmental rubrics and skill development. And one of the subjects that I developed at Frankston High is called Politics and Power. And we'd started off using the Understanding by Design model, which had been a really good framework. But in the end, when I started to develop the subject, my temptation was always to revert to the traditional teacher idea of getting excited about a particular task and then losing track of the big picture. So this professional development that I undertook really helped me in terms of keeping clarity of the goals and ideas that I was looking to implement in a subject. And I feel once I completed that PD and worked back into creating or reimagining what politics and power should look like, the subject improved substantially. So if you look at the way that I was trying to create a skill progression, previously there were lots of discrete pieces of work that didn't feed into an endpoint. And I wasn't happy with how it was working, so I went back and changed things. So as I look at it now, the way that you should develop a unit of work or a subject is to look obviously at the curriculum first, look at what your goals are, your key skills and knowledge, use the curriculum and that key goals and skills to create a progression of skill development. And then once you've worked that out, then develop things based upon that skill development and goals, which all sounds very logical, but of course that's often not the way that we approach things as teachers because we get excited about particular aspects of a task. So in the end, as I said previously, the unit wasn't flowing and wasn't building and progressing students in the way that I wanted to. So after completing this PD, what it did was I got a much better understanding of how to actually move from the base level of skill up to the more complex levels that I was looking for students to develop. And the way that I did that was by creating a common rubric that could be used to assess multiple tasks. So as I talked about previously with the wealth and work task, the key skill that I was looking to assess was decision making. So in politics and power, I had different goals, but I wanted to keep assessing those same criteria across the subject. And this is where I think you'll see the way that has flowed through to my curriculum design. Probably to gain a better understanding of what I'm talking about, you need to look at the VCAR and Melbourne University information. So I've included some links on this slide here which show what this professional development program actually was about. And I would highly recommend looking at it if you're keen to develop your understanding of subject design and unit design and curriculum design, because I found it very transformational to my approach to teaching. So in terms of my understanding of curriculum design, as I alluded to before, it's really about having a clear progression, breaking down the big picture into small, discrete skills and behaviours, and then working out how you can actually progress a student from one level to the next. And that's where it becomes challenging, because you need to be able to articulate how a student would demonstrate that particular change. And that's where a lot of the work in developing this kind of curriculum comes from, is articulating what students are actually doing. And that's something that I think teachers are often, certainly from my own perspective, are not great at. So if we know exactly what we're trying to achieve, it's a lot easier to actually do it. And the last point is giving students multiple opportunities. So if they do something once, it doesn't mean they can do it perfectly. And if they don't do it the first time, it also doesn't mean that they can't ever do it. So we need to give them lots of opportunities. So within politics, what I was really wanted students to do was to understand the fact that issues have multiple perspectives, and that the issues have an impact on students, but they also have an impact on other groups in society. I wanted them to identify and understand alternative viewpoints that other people might hold, and examine the impact of a particular viewpoint they might hold on other people. So it's quite a challenging goal, I guess, that I've set, because it really requires students to have empathy with other people's positions. And a lot of people in society struggle to understand why other people believe things to be the way that they do. So within this project, subject, I wanted to create a series of tasks that would allow students to do that. So what I ended up with in this subject was looking at a single issue and then arguing persuasively for a particular point of view. And then the next task was looking at the similar kind of thing, but then looking at how different influences might seek to shape our perspective on the issue. And then I asked students to actually go back and develop a policy based on what they'd looked at that they thought would be the best outcome and would lead to the best outcome for society. And then I asked them to take it a further notch and to form a political party which had a range of viewpoints across a whole series of different areas. And the last part was where we got very, cynical, and asked the students to then try and win an election in a simulator where they would target key voting groups. So gone from kind of an idealised idea of how political parties might function, and then probably down to a more realistic way of looking at how our democracy functions. So one of the aspects that I believe is really important for developing a good course is to include real-world links. So the innovation subject that I talked about before, we actually went and met entrepreneurs. We went to the Foundation for Young Australians and met with people developing businesses. And we went to the Frankston Foundry and we met with entrepreneurs who were setting up businesses, and some of them were really struggling and some of them probably weren't going to succeed. And the students found that really confronting to actually see the reality of entrepreneurship, the day-to-day grind and the disappointment, but also the excitement when things did go well. So having those links back to the real world was a really fantastic aspect of that subject. Another area where I think you can promote links running an entrepreneur subject especially is you can force students into the real world. If you can get kids to have to leave the internet and not engage only online, then they actually have to go and talk to people and meet people and negotiate and discuss things. And that's something that a lot of students actually are lacking, is the confidence to go and speak to people. Once they do it, they find that they're actually perfectly capable of doing it. But the thought of actually doing it is terrifying for a lot of students. In terms of the car purchase assignment, even though we're looking at a hypothetical case study, we used real car advertisements, real insurance quotes, the true cost of registration and finance, we looked at a simplified model for depreciation. So despite the fact that it is obviously a false case study, all the other aspects of a decision-making process are based on the real world. And certainly with the $20 boss, we're going back to that again, what I would like to have done was to have the students present back to mentors or people from the Foundation for Young Australians with their ideas, or reflect on it with an external mentor, because I feel that would be a really powerful experience. And the other aspect would be to compare the businesses using financial indicators. I learned some really important lessons from running this subject. The first one was that time management and students doesn't go together very well. So I had to build tools into the subject to try and teach them how to actually run a project that lasts for 9 or 10 weeks. I tried to get them to become more organised and to be able to delegate and allocate jobs within groups. And some groups really progressed in this area and others didn't. So I think were I to do this again, I would make the organisation and project management a bigger part of the pre-teaching for this subject, because that's where a lot of their businesses fell down. Also, I didn't know aspects of this task, how long they would take, so my timelines weren't particularly fantastic and I wasn't able to communicate them to the students. And that led to issues in terms of getting funding and having the money to invest and actually act upon to make their businesses successful. So communication from the teacher is also really important. The same with expectations. So students on the second business that they ran, they worked out what their expectations of each other were and set them out and articulated them, and then went on and completely contradicted what they'd set out, and found that despite having set their expectations and knowing my expectations, they still didn't live up to them. So I think the experience of having them and then the students not living up to them is also a powerful lesson, probably something that I need to work on as well if I were to run the subject again. And finally, I think encouraging failure is really important. A lot of the students, as I said previously, just couldn't deal with the fact that they weren't going to be successful, and it led to a lot of stress and a lot of discussions with parents and siblings and a whole bunch of different people. But in the end, everyone survived and they all learnt a lot from it. But it certainly was challenging for students to do that, and I think it's incredibly important for students to encounter failure and difficulty in their education. That leads on to stress management. So obviously knowing your students is really important. So some students could deal with that, the potential for failure. Others needed to be supported a lot more. And in some cases, I involved parents into these discussions because they needed to be, because they could see the effect that the assignment was having on the student and they were concerned. So working as a group to actually tell the students that, yeah, it's okay if you don't succeed, that certainly helped in this area. Also, you need to make sure that you're on very good terms with your school finance office and that they know exactly what's happening. And certainly, if you are going to change schools, don't leave the repayment of the money to the last day of the term, because that creates a few difficulties. And finally, don't make it easy. So you need to let students struggle. A lot of the students wanted me to step in and tell them what to do, and I refused to do it. And I left the decisions up to them, and sometimes that led to their businesses being unsuccessful. And I knew that was what was going to happen, but I did it purposefully because I wanted them to accept and deal with the consequences of their actions. And in the end, it created more work for me, but I think it was worth it in the end because it led to a much better experience for the students, even though they didn't appreciate it. So today we've looked at the opportunities that commerce provides to create lifelong transferable skills. Commerce should be something that's really exciting and real world, and I think there's so many opportunities, so we should seize those opportunities. It's also really important to allow students to demonstrate a number of opportunities to develop their skills and to demonstrate them. And also, I think, looking back at what we've discussed today, the idea that going back to the genesis of your subject and understanding what you're actually trying to develop and achieve, and then resetting your goals and developing an overview of that process leads to a much improved subject and experience for the students. And try and bring in as many real world links as you possibly can to your classroom. And finally, don't make it easy. We need to make students accept and deal with challenges and sometimes failure.
Thank you so much, Glenn. We really hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. The Pearson Humanities Victoria series is available for inspection, and your local Pearson consultant would be happy to provide access and demo digital resources, teacher support materials and Lightbook Starter assessment. So on behalf of Pearson, thank you for joining us today.